Hello everyone, we're going to be looking at doing the final stage of the classical portrait project today. I've got my painting, which is nice and dry now, so you can put your hands on it and you don't lift any paint on the surface. If you've left it for a while, a few weeks, you may find that you need just a dry piece of cotton to take off any dust that can sometimes cling to the surface. Make sure it's clean before you do any painting. Your reference image, your paints. You can see here I have white, yellow ochre, cadmium yellow, lemon yellow, cadmium red, crimson red, ultramarine blue, cobalt blue and a little bit of black. You're also going to need an oil. Generally for the glazing technique we're going to use a linseed oil is specifically common. You could use a poppy oil if you want to pay a little bit more money, or sun-kissed linseed oil. Now that means that the poppy oil and the sun-kissed will be a lot clearer than this oil is here, but it's up to you on what you want to do. I wouldn't recommend as anyone new using that. I'd just go for a standard linseed oil and get used to the process. You should have your reference image that you've been working from and then a range of brushes. For this class I'm going to go in and show you how to do some of the hair and the eyes a little bit more finer and polished than I did on that second layer. And then I'm going to glaze. Now with the glazing you're going to need a rag. A cotton rag is the best. You can do it with a bit of kitchen roll, but you might find it breaks up in some of the surface sticks to the picture, which isn't exactly ideal. So a cotton rag is much more preferred. Make sure it's a clean cotton rag, so put it through the washing machine. Therefore none of the cotton or the dust again cross-contaminates the paint on the surface. With regard to your brushes, have a few different sizes. I've got some finer brushes. These are of synthetic hair type, which will be quite good for doing small fiddly bits of detail. And then I have some stiffer, more oil-based brushes, which are better for doing the smoothing out of the glazing technique. So do have a range at hand. You will also need a standard rag just for wiping off your brushes, as you can see that I have over here to my left. Okay, so to start off with, I'm going to go with a fine brush. This is a 2/0. And I am going to take some colour, mix my colour, add a little bit of linseed oil just to smooth out the consistency and start working up the hair detail a little bit more. Let's see, what colour should we go for the hair? Right, I am going to keep to the dark browns. So first of all I'm going to make up a lighter brown. So cadmium with a cadmium will get me an orange. And then I'm going to use a little bit of ultramarine blue. Now you can see it's going green, that means I haven't got quite enough blue and red in the mixture. If I wanted a darker brown I'd be looking at using the crimson red. Now I'm going to take a little bit of linseed oil and I will have that poured out in a jam jar. It's good if you can do it onto your palette, but you will end up with cross-contamination, especially if you can see I'm working on a desk which is slightly slanted, so it will run down and cause a lot of problems for my other colours. Therefore if I put it in a jam jar I don't quite have that problem. I dip my brush into the linseed oil and I stir that into the colour that I've made. You'll immediately see that the colour becomes smoother in consistency and a little bit more glossy. When this colour dries it will appear more glossy as well than a standard oil paint. I can see that she's got these highlights up here. So I'm going to paint these in. Now I can take a little bit of white if I wanted to lighten that. And a little bit more of a highlight in here. Because her hair's up, it's a little bit all over the place. You can play around with the level of highlight, playing around with the white content in that mixture. Okay, now I'm going to take some of the crimson red and the ultramarine and make a far darker brown. And work on this darker shade so that it blends into segments of that hair. I'm thinking about the direction of my brush mark, how much paint I'm putting on, and trying to make the hair look like it's wrapping and curving around the head, as you can see in the picture. Now I'm going to take some black and some cadmium red and make a very, very dark and brown. I'm adding a little bit of linseed oil to increase the consistency to a smoother surface. I'm doing these strokes, you can see the gentle brush marks. Exaggerate the curves and the curls within the surface of the hair. I might end up letting a few pieces of that background initial layer come through as well, so that I get a variation of tone that looks more natural. Brush, clean it off, really pick up a little bit more of that lighter brown and work that in. And it's a game of toing and froing. The more shades you have in here, the more realistic it'll look. Obviously, you've got a bit more time than me, as always, so you can play around with that. You can also generate, as long as you've got enough paint, you get too much linseed oil, you'll see that it just vanishes when you put it on the surface of the picture. Create these straggly little marks. And you want to paint so your brush comes in from the hair out to the end of those hair paintbrush marks. Okay, you're going to be playing around with your tone, making it appear much more natural and fluid. So you should be getting some hair like that. Pretty easy to do. It's just a kind of slow, gentle process. You know, take your time, try and be accurate, look at the highlights and the shadows and where you can see them in relationship to one another. Right, so eyes. Let's work down the brush. So eyes are fairly dark. I'm going to make a dark green. If I take ultramarine blue and a cadmium yellow, it'll create quite an emerald tone of green, which is fairly dark. I'm going to add in a little bit of linseed oil. And I'm going to just put in a little bit here and there, not all over, just a little bit. Okay, so you can see I just put a little bit down here and a little bit over here. Then I'm going to take my stiff small brush, okay, and I'm going to work it out into the shade below that's dry. If you put too much on, you'll find that you cover it too quickly. I'm going to do the same over here. And work that to that left, right hand side of the eye. Now I want to lighten this up a little bit to throw in some of the highlights. The green. I'm going to play around with my blue and yellow combinations to make a softer green shade. Quite happy with that. That's better. I'm going to put a little bit of linseed oil into that. And it's the same approach, but you're working on the highlights. Throwing in that shade. I want the eye just to be a little bit lighter. I might end up needing to lighten that even more actually. See a little bit more light coming in. And my brush marks are coming from the pupil out to the outer edge of the iris. Got this also coming over here. So I'm going to just move out a little bit more on here. You can see I've blent a little bit in the brown, so rub it off the face. Dangers of rushing oil painting. Now I'm going to wipe my brush and I'm going to take some of that black, add it back in, so I've got that cadmium and black combination. This has already got linseed oil in it. And I'm going to fill it in to exaggerate pupils. I'm also going to put in a little bit along the top of the eye, because you get the shadow from the eyelid casting down on the iris. And immediately you can see it's much stronger than how it was initially. I do need to put in that white highlight. Take a little bit of white. There's a bit here, a little bit down there, again on this side as well, the lens reflecting. Now I need to make our eyelashes a bit darker, so I'm going to use that recipe, cadmium red, black, linseed oil. A little bit harder than I wanted. I'm going to take off some of that. And just blend out some of that fold in the eyelid. Our eyes are much stronger now. You can see the difference between the eyes. Let's do the same over here. And normally you would take a lot of time doing this. You do it quite fine. I'm just knocking this up quite quickly. So be aware this is by no means the level of perfection that you should have. Into those eyebrows. Okay. And I think also I might just clean the brush and put in a little bit of white, well, creamy white, remember, because I don't want anything too white for that white of the eyeball. I'm going to add a little bit of crimson to make it a tad pinky tone. And add that just down here. Okay, that's looking better. A little bit more clean. I'm going to increase the shadow on the nose now. And I'm just doing that over the top. I'm going to wipe my brush. Use my stick brush just to ease that out. So you get a variation. I'm going to put in a little bit more around the side of the nostril. That stiff brush so you don't get such a hard edged mark, but you still get the tone. So, okay, easy peasy noses. Let's just do a little bit on the lips. I'm going to take that white, add a little bit of red, a little bit of linseed oil. The lips a little bit. I think it's going to be a little bit of cross-contamination between the cadmium red and the crimson red. It looks a bit orangey as well. Maybe a little bit of the cadmium yellow. That top lip should be slightly darker than the bottom lip. How's that looking? Yeah, she's looking a little bit too Disney for my liking, but it gives you the idea. Now we get to doing the really interesting part, which is the glazing technique. Right, so doing the glazing technique is kind of the part now. Now I haven't finished all her hair over here, but we're just looking at how to do things rather than actual end examples of how to do it perfectly, thank goodness. Her skin in the picture is a little bit more orangey than I have it. I've got her a little bit more pinky. She'd be painted up to a little bit more of a finer level as well because the white highlights need to be put in stronger. So to start off with, I would do those. I'm going to take some white and I'm going to add some linseed oil to the white. Now I've got a little bit of cross-contamination from the pink, which is good because I don't want the white to be pure white, it's too harsh. I'm going to then throw that in here along the side of her nose. She's got a nose, you get to see a little bit kind of like that. So you've got that. Then you take your rag and you work it into the paint layer that's dry underneath. Now you can see that that highlight is much stronger than the highlight was originally. So I have to work that across her face. She's got quite a strong highlight on this side and the light is hitting her. So again, if I put in a little bit of paint and I use my rag and I work the paint into the surface. And this is pretty much repeated around the whole face for the glazing. With glazing you can either use a lighter colour and bring in highlights, or you can make a darker colour and bring in shadows, which we're going to do as well. You can already see how much stronger it is. If you want to, if you find that you haven't quite gone as sharp as you want to go, you can add in a little bit more and you can smooth it out. Now you can use a stiff brush, some people prefer that because it's a little bit more polished and easier to handle. Some people prefer a rag because they feel that it absorbs the linseed oil better on the surface and gives a much more realistic representation. It doesn't have to be a white highlight, it could just be a very soft skin colour if you want to. And you can build it up in multiple layers so that you can control it quite slowly and get realistic results. Right, she's got quite a strong highlight that runs down here. Take my linseed oil. If you've got the right consistency for the highlight and the glazing, it should be fairly runny. You can see I'm being quite tough on it. Try to avoid using white in its neatest form. Always have some kind of cross-contamination with another shade. And don't be worried if you overdo it a little bit. You can always bring it back down, let it dry, and then darken it. You can see this, it's been much sharper. So I'm doing multiple layers. Now if you want it to work really strong, with glazing you'd usually do some glazing, you'd allow it to dry and then you'd do another layer of glazing. It'll give you, well, it'll yield far better results that way. It's as if you're trapping pigment in a translucent clear varnish and it will deliver more like a stained glass image. So I've thrown in some highlights to give you an idea of how that works. I'm going to put in a little bit on this cheek. Got a bit cross contamination because I'm rushing with my brush work. And that highlight down there. I'm going to wipe my brush off and I'm going to make a little bit more of a creamy skin colour and do some glazing with that. So I've got some yellow ochre, a little bit of cadmium red, and some white. And it's a little bit more of an orangey shade. I think I probably need to pink it up a tad with her. I'm gonna take my linseed oil, make my glaze, so it's a runny solution. I'm gonna get my brush and apply a little bit on her, such. And I'm gonna use my rag to rub it in. Because you're sticking that translucent layer on top of the colours that you've already laid down, the light is coming through the multiple layers and blending. You can create very realistic results. If you want to, you could always use a brush. Smooth it out, but you do need some kind of hair that will absorb the excess colour. You can see there it's not quite absorbing it. I think my brush is too stiff. Should be laying very fine shades up using this technique. I think generally that is as much as I can do at this stage with the glazing. I need to allow it to dry and then I'd go back in and I'd glaze even more on the face and skin tones. At the moment though, I do feel like the background's letting it down a bit, so I'm just going to boost that background shade because I think it'll add a little bit more contrast. I'll look better. Gently fuzz over the edge of the face because I don't want it too crisp. It won't look natural if it's crisp. You can see what a difference that makes. Okay, you should be ending up with something kind of like that. Now, you would build up a lot more layers in between doing the final piece and the glazing layers. And the glazing layers, you'd ultimately be looking at doing a good few of those, 3-4 layers of glazing. So you would have allowed this to dry, you'd come back in, you'd glaze more, you'd allow it to dry, and you'd do that 3 times. It will be long and laborious, but yield far better results. Hopefully yours is going well.